On the wooded slopes of Kings Mountain, riflemen were climbing toward a summit that Major Patrick Ferguson believed defensible. His loyalists could see movement below, but trees concealed how completely separate militia columns were already closing around them. Ferguson had chosen high ground and gathered his command tightly, the conventional answer to enemies approaching from several directions. Yet the ridge's protection carried a hidden cost. Every descending charge surrendered height that loyalists then had to recover. Below, men who had crossed the Appalachians prepared to fight without a regular army's command structure, uniforms, or supply system. Their arrival was not an accidental frontier uprising. It followed a message Ferguson had deliberately sent across the mountains. That message was supposed to isolate Patriot leaders, frighten their neighbors, and secure Britain's exposed western flank without a campaign. Instead, it gave scattered settlements a common danger, their militia leaders a common target, and Ferguson an approaching enemy. To understand why intimidation became mobilization, the story begins weeks earlier, after a British victory far to the east. In August 1780, British forces shattered a major American army at Camden, deepening Patriot weakness across the South. General Charles Cornwallis now saw an opening to extend royal control from South Carolina into neighboring North Carolina itself. Victory at Camden did not make the backcountry obedient. It removed a field army while leaving local loyalties violently divided. Farms, roads, and courthouse communities remained contested, with Patriot and Loyalist networks drawing support from neighbors living uncomfortably close. Cornwallis needed more than a northward march. His army required protected communications, supplies, and dependable supporters behind its advance. A hostile mountain frontier threatened that design because armed patriots could raid Loyalists, disrupt routes, and force detachments backward. Cornwallis therefore sent Ferguson toward the western districts to suppress Patriot activity and shield Loyalist communities from retaliation there. Ferguson was not commanding British Redcoat battalions there. His field force was largely composed of American Loyalist militia instead. That distinction mattered. The campaign was a civil conflict inside the Revolution, fought among communities divided by allegiance and survival. Ferguson's assignment demanded both force and persuasion. Loyalists needed reassurance, while suspected patriots had to appear isolated and vulnerable. British success had made intimidation seem plausible. Camden suggested organized resistance was collapsing, and Cornwallis appeared ready to advance northward. From Ferguson's position, the mountain settlements looked like a peripheral problem that firm pressure might settle before invasion began. Geography reinforced that judgment. The Blue Ridge separated those communities from the principal roads, armies, and political authorities eastward. Their distance could mean weakness. It also meant outsiders could misread how quickly kinship, local leadership, and trails connected them. Many inhabitants beyond the crest had not begun the war as eager revolutionaries, and frontier priorities often remained intensely local. Land, families, and settlement security could matter more immediately than decisions from distant governments or the fortunes of regular armies. Ferguson's mission turned those local concerns into military leverage. Submission promised protection, while resistance appeared to invite organized punishment. He moved through the Carolina backcountry gathering Loyalists and pursuing Patriot militia, while Cornwallis prepared the broader advance north. Each Loyalist who joined strengthened Ferguson locally, but also sharpened the danger perceived by neighboring Patriot families and leaders. Backcountry warfare rarely offered clean front lines. Information traveled through prisoners, riders, relatives, churches, and settlements, rather than headquarters. A warning carried through that network could reach farther than a patrol, and Ferguson chose exactly that instrument deliberately. He used a Whig prisoner to carry his terms toward the inhabited mountains, where Patriot militia leaders could hear them. The substance was unmistakable. Continued resistance would bring Ferguson across the mountains to punish leaders and devastate their country. Later accounts preserved vivid wording about hanging leaders and destruction by fire and sword, making the ultimatum personally concrete. This was coercion, not mere boasting. Ferguson wanted the threat to travel because fear could succeed where dispersal hindered pursuit. The logic depended on one assumption: mountain communities would calculate separately, leaving exposed Patriot organizers without enough collective support. That assumption was reasonable enough to act upon after Camden, but it overlooked what the warning made newly visible. Across the mountains, scattered households did not hear an abstract imperial demand. They heard a direct threat against homes and leaders. The message reduced a complicated war to an immediate frontier choice: wait for Ferguson separately or gather before he crossed. Militia Colonel Isaac Shelby received the warning in the Western country and carried its implications to other regional leaders. His task was not to defend one cabin or chase one raiding party. It was to create cooperation quickly. Shelby understood that waiting would surrender initiative, allowing Ferguson to choose which settlement faced punishment first, and leaving neighbors uncertain. Acting together offered a different logic. Militias could cross the ridge, find Ferguson, and fight before his threat became invasion. Shelby carried the warning to John Sevier, whose influence among Watauga settlements could turn alarm into organized manpower within days. Other colonels across Virginia and the Carolinas joined the effort, bringing separate companies under a temporary shared purpose quickly. No Continental commander had ordered this concentration. The leaders were assembling local militia through personal influence and urgent correspondence. That independence accelerated mobilization because they did not wait for distant approval, but it also weakened unified command from the outset. Every colonel retained influence over his own men, and cooperation depended upon negotiation rather than an established chain of command. Riders carried the summons between cabins and clearings, while men decided whether Ferguson's warning justified leaving farms unguarded behind. The decision involved immediate risk. Crossing eastward meant abandoning families temporarily to confront a force whose location might change. Ferguson's own terms made remaining home seem dangerous as well, since passivity offered no guarantee of lasting safety. His warning therefore altered the objective. Instead of protecting isolated settlements, the leaders could remove the approaching threat itself. Participation remained voluntary and uneven, reflecting divided loyalties, family obligations, local feuds, and uncertainty about the proposed expedition itself. Those who joined were not entering a conventional army. Many arrived with personal horses, rifles, clothing, and provisions from home. Their rifles offered accuracy at distance, though slower loading and no practical bayonet capability distinguished them from standard military muskets. Years of hunting and travel through broken country had produced useful skills, although frontier experience alone could not ensure discipline. What they lacked was a proper supply train, standardized equipment, and the staff machinery that sustained regular forces on campaign. Food had to move with them, so necessities went into packs and cattle were driven along as future provisions. This arrangement reduced dependence on wagon roads, but every mile consumed what the expedition could carry or herd forward. Sycamore Shoals on the Watauga River became the concentration point where separate companies could count strength and coordinate departure. The site lay within the settlements Ferguson had threatened, turning a familiar river crossing into an improvised military assembly. Horses crowded tethering rails, bedrolls rested beside rifles, and trampled grass marked the arrival of companies from scattered valleys. Around them, uncertainty remained. Ferguson's exact intentions were unclear, and nobody knew whether his command might cross first soon. Speed, therefore, mattered more than perfect organization. Delay would let him disperse opponents, gather loyalists, or threaten another district. Minister Samuel Doak addressed the gathering, framing the march as defense of homes, liberty, and neighboring communities under threat. His appeal reinforced the message Ferguson had unintentionally created. Danger east of the mountains now belonged to everyone gathered. The leaders still needed a workable plan. They would cross the Blue Ridge, unite with additional militia, and seek Ferguson. Finding him was not guaranteed. Backcountry roads forked through wooded country, while reports could become stale before reaching camp. Ferguson also possessed mobility and local loyalist information. If warned early, he could withdraw toward Cornwallis or choose stronger ground. The expedition consequently depended upon secrecy, quick movement, and cooperation from communities able to report his route with useful speed. Command arrangements remained collective rather than elegant. Colonels agreed upon the objective without eliminating the independence of their contingents. That compromise was fragile, yet practical. Insisting upon formal hierarchy might have delayed the march or divided the gathering. Shared danger supplied what regulations could not, a reason for companies from different settlements to accept one campaign together. By late September, roughly 1,000 men were converging or preparing to move, though totals shifted as detachments joined. Numbers alone did not solve logistics. 1,000 riders and walkers required food, forage, ammunition, and navigable mountain passages. Neither enthusiasm nor marksmanship could shorten the wilderness road. The expedition first had to survive its own improvised system. The route ahead crossed steep ridges and valleys where wagons would hinder movement, confirming the choice to travel lightly. Lightness bought speed at the price of endurance. Lost animals, spoiled provisions, or delayed stragglers could weaken every company. Before departure, leaders reviewed the reports available and accepted a central uncertainty. Ferguson might move while they crossed eastward. Once committed, turning back would leave the warning unanswered and expose the organizers who had publicly gathered resistance there. The companies left Sycamore Shoals with no certainty of battle, only a shared decision to carry danger away from home. At Sycamore Shoals, departure transformed an angry assembly into a moving column whose weaknesses now became physical burdens. Men filed away from the Watauga carrying blankets, ammunition, food, and rifles, with no wagons organizing the march behind them. Driven cattle supplied meat on the journey, but animals moved slowly and demanded forage along the same difficult route. Horses increased speed for many militiamen, although steep passages could erase that advantage and stretch companies across miles of trail. Once the settlements receded, resupply became uncertain. The expedition had chosen mobility over the safety of a fixed base. Mountain terrain immediately imposed order of its own, narrowing the column where wooded slopes permitted only a confined passage. A company delayed at one crossing could separate from those ahead, weakening communication among colonels already sharing authority uneasily. Local knowledge compensated for missing staff work because experienced riders understood gaps, river approaches, and paths unsuitable for wagons. That knowledge did not remove distance. The expedition's route across the mountains and onward would total roughly 330 miles. Each mile carried them farther from their farms, while reports about Ferguson remained incomplete and dependent upon civilian messengers. The force could not simply follow a visible army. It had to cross first, then discover where its target had gone. Pursuit, therefore, began as an exercise in prediction, with leaders judging roads Ferguson might use and loyalist support he could reach. Their advantage was political as much as geographic. Friendly households could offer directions, warnings, provisions, and fresh knowledge of movement. Their danger followed the same logic. Loyalist residents could report the column, helping Ferguson avoid contact or prepare an ambush. Silence and speed mattered because surprise could compensate for loose organization, while early discovery would expose every structural weakness. Camp routines remained simple, shaped less by regulation than the need to feed animals, protect ammunition, and resume movement. No single uniform made the expedition look like an army. Hunting shirts and ordinary frontier clothing reflected local militia service. That appearance could suggest disorder, but the companies were connected by known officers and habits formed in their own communities. Discipline worked horizontally as well as downward. A man who ignored an order did so before neighbors who knew him. This social cohesion could sustain hardship, though it could not automatically settle disputes between senior colonels over strategy or precedence. For the moment, terrain reduced those differences. Every contingent faced the same narrow paths, cold heights, and limited provisions. Crossing the crest marked more than geographic progress. Ferguson's threatened victims were now moving into the districts where he operated. Retreat remained possible, but every eastward stage increased its political cost and made the expedition's offensive purpose unmistakable to all. Their leaders had reversed Ferguson's intended sequence. Rather than receiving his invasion, they were forcing him to respond to theirs. That reversal still existed only on maps and trails. It would matter militarily only if they found him before dispersing. Fatigue accumulated without producing a battle, and each uncertain report risked sending the column down another punishing road eastward. Additional militia could solve part of the manpower problem, but joining contingents also complicated decisions, marching order, and supply. Reinforcements nevertheless mattered, because Ferguson's strength was uncertain and the mountain force could not risk meeting superior numbers alone. As companies converged, the expedition grew beyond its original settlements, becoming a coalition of backcountry patriots with overlapping interests. Shared purpose concealed different obligations. Some leaders guarded home districts, while others sought Ferguson as the immediate operational threat. Keeping the coalition moving required evidence that pursuit remained possible, not merely outrage over a message already several days old. East of the ridge, information became more abundant, but also more contradictory, shaped by frightened civilians and partisan allegiance. Reports placed Ferguson on different roads or near different settlements, forcing leaders to compare timing, direction, and messenger credibility. A mistaken choice would cost days. Ferguson could then reach stronger support, warn Cornwallis, or escape toward the main army. Ferguson had reason to move because Patriot activity threatened Loyalists he was assigned to protect across the western districts. His command's mobility also gave him choices the pursuers lacked. He could gather men, change routes, and seek defensible ground. Still, the approaching coalition changed his problem from suppressing scattered bands into judging the direction and size of one concentration. Every new Patriot company enlarged that threat, while every mile east shortened the distance between Ferguson and the men he had warned. The frontier leaders now needed reliable intelligence more than additional speeches. Anger had started the expedition, but location would decide it. Ahead lay a widening search through contested country, where the next trustworthy report could determine whether their march remained unified. Reliable intelligence arrived through local networks, gradually turning a broad eastward search into a pursuit with roads, destinations, and timing. Messengers described Ferguson withdrawing through the backcountry, evidence that the militia concentration had already disrupted his original western mission. He was no longer simply hunting Patriot sympathizers. He also had to protect his Loyalists from an unexpectedly concentrated enemy. That pressure rewarded the Overmountain leaders' decision to cross first, although it did not guarantee they could force a battle. Ferguson could still move toward Cornwallis, where British support would transform a militia pursuit into a far more dangerous contest. Thus, speed became the coalition's decisive resource, while exhausted men and animals made every additional march harder to sustain. The pursuers therefore accepted increasing fatigue because preserving contact mattered more than arriving fresh after Ferguson had escaped entirely. Their improvised logistics now showed both sides of the same choice. Traveling light accelerated movement but limited endurance severely. Provisions consumed on the mountain crossing could not be replaced by any organized train waiting behind the advancing companies. Friendly communities could help, but local support was neither uniform nor limitless in a region divided by civil war. Militiamen who had joined to defend particular settlements now had to continue beyond them, trusting leaders from other districts. No formal authorization had appeared from the Continental Army, yet turning back would waste the advantage their initiative had created. Their coalition survived because the immediate objective remained concrete: locate Ferguson before he reached safety or scattered his command. Reports gained value when separate witnesses described the same movement, allowing colonels to discard rumors that pointed elsewhere entirely. Each confirmed direction compressed the search area and reduced Ferguson's freedom to maneuver without revealing his destination too early. Coalition leaders also acquired reinforcements as they advanced, increasing strength while making the column harder to coordinate and feed. More men meant greater security against Ferguson, but also more horses, voices, campfires, and tracks that could betray the pursuit. Secrecy was never absolute in populated country. The practical goal was to learn faster than Ferguson could effectively react. That contest favored whichever side interpreted fragmentary reports correctly, since neither commander possessed a complete picture of the other. Warnings reaching Ferguson indicated militia were converging, but reports could exaggerate their numbers, conceal routes, or arrive too late. His rational response was withdrawal toward friendlier support while seeking ground where his Loyalists could resist pursuit if overtaken. That movement confirmed the frontier leaders' central calculation. Their appearance east of the mountains had transferred pressure onto him. Still, forcing Ferguson backward was not the same as destroying his command. A missed interception could leave the threat intact. The colonels kept their contingents together by emphasizing the shared target rather than reopening questions of precedence or authority. This restraint was operationally important because a command dispute during pursuit could divide roads and surrender their numerical advantage. Men at the rear followed hoofprints and familiar officers, while scouts and messengers carried directions toward the front rapidly. The expedition was gradually becoming less a spontaneous march and more a coordinated attempt to close every likely escape route. Its coordination remained personal rather than institutional, dependent upon colonels continuing to accept a common reading of events. Fresh reports eventually narrowed Ferguson's position toward the wooded rise known as King's Mountain, near the Carolina boundary in the backcountry. For the pursuers, this was the first clear opportunity to replace movement and rumor with a fixed objective nearby. For Ferguson, the ridge offered elevation, a compact position, and time to organize loyalists against approaching militia columns below. High ground made immediate sense because attackers would climb through woods while defenders operated from the summit above them. Its narrow crest also helped Ferguson keep a dispersed militia command within reach, rather than guarding several distant roads. Yet the same ridge limited withdrawal. If surrounded, loyalists would have no open flank through which to escape easily. Ferguson could reasonably expect attackers to approach unevenly, allowing his force to concentrate against each threat in turn below. That expectation depended upon seeing the danger soon enough and preventing separate Patriot groups from forming one enclosing ring. The Patriots therefore needed to approach quietly, maintain direction beneath tree cover, and reach assigned sectors before discovery there. Their clothing created another problem because neither side possessed uniform dress that reliably separated Patriot from Loyalist militia nearby. Patriot fighters used pieces of white paper in their hat brims, while Loyalists identified themselves with pine sprigs instead. With the target finally fixed, the long pursuit gave way to a harder task, surrounding Ferguson without warning him. Fixed intelligence finally allowed the colonels to divide their mounted force, selecting roughly 900 men for the rapid closing movement. Those chosen could travel faster than the broader column, leaving slower companions and logistical burdens behind during the final approach. This selection traded total strength for surprise, because every hour saved reduced Ferguson's chance to withdraw toward Cornwallis in safety. Rain and hard riding had already tested equipment and animals, yet the detached riders continued toward the reported Loyalist position. Near the mountain, they dismounted and secured horses away from the ridge, removing noise and preparing to fight on foot. Foot movement also suited the wooded slopes, where riders would struggle to maintain formation and present conspicuous targets among trees. The colonels assigned sectors around the ridge, creating several commands that could climb independently while serving one enclosing design. No headquarters could monitor every slope once movement began, so each detachment depended upon local officers interpreting the shared plan. Their intended advantage was not a single overwhelming charge, but simultaneous pressure that denied Ferguson a safe direction for retreat. Trees concealed approaching riflemen, though the same cover obscured neighboring companies and increased the danger of fragmented action during battle. White paper and Patriot hats offered a simple answer to confusion, especially when ordinary clothing made allegiance otherwise invisible. Pine sprigs served the Loyalists similarly, small field signs revealing how closely this battle divided people from the same region. Before contact, the Patriot group spread around the base, trying to occupy their sectors without exposing the larger encirclement. Ferguson's summit position looked strongest from below, where elevation shortened defenders' view and lengthened every attacker's difficult ascent through woods. At the top, however, the narrow ground offered little depth, leaving limited space for reserves, regrouping, or orderly withdrawal. That weakness would matter only if every route came under pressure. One incomplete sector could become Ferguson's escape path. Silence during the approach protected the design, allowing separate detachments to climb near firing distance before Loyalists understood their distribution. Once firing began, concealment would disappear, and the battle would depend upon whether pressure remained coordinated around the ridge. Ferguson's Loyalists held the crest in a tighter body, giving them the ability to push rapidly toward any threatened slope. Their bayonet-equipped muskets offered an important close-range advantage against riflemen whose long guns could not answer in the same manner. Ferguson could therefore drive downhill against one group, disrupt its ascent, then recover the summit before another attack matured. The tactic was rational on a ridge facing disconnected militia, and early fighting appeared to confirm its local effectiveness. Loyalist rushes forced some patriots back down the slope, breaking their immediate momentum without opening the surrounding ring entirely. Descending patriots used trees and rocks for cover, reloaded their rifles, and began climbing again after the Loyalists withdrew. Here the terrain changed meaning. A successful downhill push displaced attackers briefly, but it also carried defenders away from the crest. Returning uphill consumed time and cohesion, while Patriot detachments elsewhere continued advancing against sectors momentarily stripped of nearby defenders. Each local Loyalist success therefore created pressure somewhere else, because Ferguson lacked enough depth to dominate every slope simultaneously. The Patriots did not need every company to advance together. They needed defeated groups to return before the ring opened. Backcountry cohesion helped them do that, as officers regrouped neighbors who remained connected even after being pushed downhill temporarily. Rifle accuracy also punished exposure on the summit, limiting how freely Loyalists could stand, observe, and reinforce threatened points. Smoke among the trees and uneven ground reduced clarity, leaving Ferguson to respond to immediate threats rather than command the whole perimeter. His central position enabled movement, but every response was reactive, prompted by riflemen appearing from another wooded approach below. Patriot command remained decentralized, which had seemed a weakness during the march, but now made the encirclement harder to paralyze. No single setback could halt every detachment, since companies on opposite slopes continued according to their own officers' judgment. This independence carried risks of confusion, yet around Kings Mountain it sustained pressure when centralized control was nearly impossible. Ferguson's warning had assembled the coalition, and his chosen ridge now compressed that coalition tightly against his command from below. The defenders still resisted effectively, and repeated downhill movements showed that elevation and close-range weapons retained real value there. Those movements could not solve the larger geometry. Every return to the summit revealed another Patriot group climbing elsewhere. After repeated advances, the enclosing detachments gained ground near the crest, narrowing the space Ferguson's Loyalists could still control. The battle had become a contest of endurance, with Ferguson's command contained while pressure accumulated from every wooded slope below. As Patriots neared the crest, Ferguson's ability to shift Loyalists between threatened sectors diminished with every renewed ascent uphill. Companies driven downhill earlier returned through the trees, proving that temporary repulse had not restored a secure perimeter above. From Ferguson's perspective, separate emergencies now arrived too quickly for one compact command to answer without exposing another side. The ridge that concentrated his strength also concentrated Patriot rifle fire, narrowing the ground where officers could reorganize defenders. Loyalist charges still descended with force, but attackers increasingly yielded only enough ground to reload and resume climbing again. Their method did not require holding every yard. It required keeping Ferguson occupied until the surrounding columns reached the summit. On one slope, a retreat could resemble failure, while across the ridge, another company was advancing into newly weakened resistance. This pattern denied Ferguson a decisive counterattack, because success against one detachment never removed the others from the battle. Ammunition, fatigue, and confusion now weighed on both sides, though only the Loyalists lacked an open route away from the ridge. The Patriots' loose structure remained dangerous, since units could mistake allies in ordinary clothing or advance without neighboring support. White paper and pine sprigs reduced that uncertainty, but smoke and trees still complicated identification across the tightening perimeter. Officers relied on shouted directions and familiar companies rather than any clear view of the entire battle from below. Decentralization worked because the mission remained simple and spatially obvious. Each company climbed, maintained contact, and prevented escape nearby. Ferguson's task was more complex, demanding local counterattacks while preserving cohesion, ammunition, communications, and keeping one withdrawal route available. Each necessity competed with the others, and the constricted summit offered little room to satisfy all of them together. Had one Patriot sector collapsed permanently, the Loyalists might have concentrated there and broken through the incomplete ring below. Instead, repulsed riflemen repeatedly returned, closing the temporary gaps before Ferguson could convert local advantage into an escape route. Pressure reached the crest unevenly, with some companies gaining the summit while others still fought upward through cover below. Once Patriots established positions near the top, Loyalist movement across the narrow ridge became increasingly exposed and difficult to coordinate. Ferguson continued directing resistance, recognizable among his men, as the perimeter contracted and command space steadily disappeared around him. Accounts agree Ferguson was killed during the final fighting, although dramatic details surrounding his last movements vary among later retellings. His death removed the one officer holding the Loyalist force together precisely when coordinated resistance had become most necessary. Command disruption did not instantly silence every defender, but it made organized recovery increasingly unlikely on the crowded summit. Some Loyalists began seeking surrender as Patriot fighters reached the crest, and resistance fragmented into isolated groups across the summit. Stopping the battle proved harder than winning control, because anger, noise, and decentralized command outlasted Ferguson's organized defense on the summit. Patriot losses and memories of earlier backcountry violence intensified the danger faced by Loyalists attempting to surrender on the summit. Contemporary and later accounts describe continued killing after surrender signals, though precise sequences and responsibility remain difficult to reconstruct. Officers eventually restored enough control to halt the firing, leaving prisoners beside abandoned equipment along the narrow ridge afterward. The silence revealed the result of encirclement. Ferguson's Loyalist command no longer existed as an effective field force there. More than battlefield position had failed. Ferguson's repeated countercharges could delay separate columns, but they could not dissolve the ring. The summit had amplified tactical strength while sacrificing operational escape, a trade Ferguson could not reverse after complete encirclement. Patriot riflemen had also paid for every ascent, and their victory was neither effortless nor produced by marksmanship alone. Local leadership, converging intelligence, rapid movement, and repeated regrouping had all been necessary before rifle fire became decisive on the ridge. Ferguson's choices remained understandable at each stage, from coercive warning to withdrawal and final reliance upon elevated ground at Kings Mountain. Their combined effect was catastrophic because every choice assumed opponents would remain divided, delayed, or unable to sustain pressure. On Kings Mountain, that assumption ended among captured Loyalists, riderless horses, discarded pine sprigs, and white papers dampened by weather. Reported totals vary, but roughly 200 Loyalists were killed, many were wounded, and hundreds became prisoners after the battle. Patriot losses were far smaller, though the victory left the exhausted coalition responsible for guarding and moving a vast captive column. That responsibility immediately replaced combat with a logistical crisis, since the militia had barely supplied itself during pursuit already. Before the wider consequences could be measured, the victors had to leave the ridge with prisoners, wounded men, and uncertain provisions. Leaving Kings Mountain proved difficult because victors burdened by casualties and hundreds of prisoners lacked a regular army's transport system. Food intended for pursuit now had to sustain captives, guards, and injured men across hostile, divided country during the march. The coalition had won through speed, but victory slowed it, forcing colonels to improvise custody, rations, and movement again. Prisoners vastly outnumbered the losses Ferguson had expected to inflict, creating a security problem the expedition had never planned. Backcountry anger did not vanish with surrender, and later reprisals showed that Kings Mountain had not ended the region's civil war. News of Ferguson's destruction traveled beyond the prisoner column, reaching British commanders as Cornwallis pursued his northern strategy there. The loss removed the officer assigned to secure the western flank and erased the Loyalist force gathered around him. Cornwallis could not treat the backcountry as pacified, while militia capable of crossing mountains remained active behind his army. Ferguson's defeat contributed to Cornwallis withdrawing from Charlotte, postponing his advance into North Carolina while he reassessed the western danger. Kings Mountain did not decide the revolution, nor did it permanently destroy British military power throughout the southern colonies. It did deny Cornwallis an important Loyalist command, disrupt his immediate timetable, and encourage Patriot resistance after the disaster at Camden. For frontier communities, The result vindicated offensive defense. Crossing the mountains had prevented Ferguson from choosing their homes as battlefield. Their success rested neither on formal authorization nor superior organization, but on converting local networks into operational speed at the decisive moment. Riders spread warning, officers assembled neighbors, households supplied information, and scouts reduced a vast search to one ridge nearby. Once there, decentralized companies attacked from separate slopes, recovering from local reverses without waiting for central direction from headquarters. That system worked because the objective stayed simple and shared, although the same looseness complicated surrender and prisoner control. Ferguson's ultimatum therefore acted as a catalyst, not the sole cause of resistance among communities already divided by war. Camden, British expansion, local loyalties, and fear for property had already created conditions for mobilization across the western frontier settlements. The warning supplied urgency, a named enemy, and an unmistakable consequence if separate settlements continued waiting alone at home. Ferguson meant to make the mountains a boundary behind which resistance would remain frightened and politically isolated from allies. Instead, his messenger carried the threat across that boundary and gave its communities a reason to cross it together. Subscribe for more military history and decide, was Ferguson's threat the decisive mistake or only the spark resistance needed?